The grandest ballroom of the London season glittered like a fever dream. Eleanor Voss stood against the wall between two tall windows, her fan closed in her hand, her eyes quietly turned away from the crowd. She was not rich. She carried no title that made ambitious mothers lean forward in their chairs. She wore no rubies, no borrowed diamonds, no carefully constructed smile, while every other woman in the room sparkled with intention, feathers, gold thread, the calculated gleam of jewels placed precisely where they would catch the light. Eleanor wore simple blue-grey muslin and had arranged herself with practiced skill to be overlooked. She was not plain. She was invisible by choice. There was a difference, one she had worked years to perfect. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Harcliffe swept the room with his eyes the way he always did, with absolute boredom and the cold precision that made men step aside and women forget how to breathe. He had done this every season for 6 years. He had never once been surprised, until tonight. His gaze moved past Lady Celeste in her rubies, past Miss Harrington and her considerable fortune, past every carefully presented, perfectly dressed, strategically glittering woman in that room, and stopped on her, the girl against the wall, the only person in the entire ballroom who clearly did not want to be seen. 3 seconds. That was all. But something in him, something buried beneath years of elegant armor and practiced indifference, and woke up. And London would never understand why. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, because this story is going to break your heart in exactly the right way. The ballroom at Thornfield House breathed gold. Candles everywhere. In the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like artificial constellations, in the gilded wall sconces, in the small, trembling flames that lit women's faces with a warmth that made them look like portraits. The smell was of fresh roses and expensive perfume layered over the heat of 100 bodies. The violins played something delicate that no one was truly listening to. Eleanor listened. She stood against the wall in her simple blue-grey muslin gown. Her aunt had suggested pink. Eleanor had declined with quiet firmness, and watched the room the way she always watched rooms, not with longing, not with resentment, with the careful, almost clinical attention of someone who had decided long ago that observation was safer than participation. Around her, the season performed itself with exhausting precision. Lady Harrington wore 3 peacock feathers in her hair and diamonds at her throat that caught every candle in the room. Miss Blythe had arrived in ivory silk embroidered with gold thread so fine it seemed to move like water. Even the modest debutantes had their carefully calculated accessories. A cameo placed just so, a ribbon chosen with strategic carelessness. Eleanor had pearl earrings, small ones, borrowed from her aunt. She had stopped trying to compete years ago. Invisibility, she had discovered, was its own kind of armor. She was good at watching people, better at it than at anything a young woman of her position was supposed to excel at. She did not embroider with exceptional skill. She did not play the pianoforte in a way that made anyone set down their conversation, but she could read a room the way other women read novels, with total absorption, noticing everything. Lady Pemberton, for instance, was smiling at Miss Harrington with warmth convincing enough to deceive almost anyone, but her fingers pressed her fan too tightly, the knuckles just barely whitening at the joints. Envy, Eleanor noted silently. Miss Harrington had already danced twice with Lord Ashton. The grey-haired gentleman near the east window was on his 3rd glass of wine in 40 minutes and kept glancing toward the door with the expression of a man calculating the earliest possible moment of dignified escape. Eleanor recognized that expression intimately. It was usually her own. "You are going to stand in this corner all evening, aren't you?" Her Aunt Meredith appeared at her side, low-voiced and faintly exasperated, carrying the familiar scent of lavender and iron determination. "Most likely," Eleanor replied, without moving her eyes from the room. "The Viscount Pemberton's son asked you to dance." "I know," I declined gracefully. "Why?" Eleanor turned to look at her aunt. Meredith Voss was a woman of 50, with fine bones and sharp eyes, who had spent the last 4 years trying to steer her niece toward a reasonable marriage. Eleanor felt genuine love for her and a constant low-grade guilt about the effort. "Because he spent the last 20 minutes looking at Miss Harrington's neckline," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Dancing with him would have been awkward for us both." Her aunt opened her mouth, closed it, glanced briefly at Miss Harrington, snapped her fan shut with a sound like a small verdict. "You are impossible," she murmured, and moved away toward the refreshment table. Eleanor turned back to the room. That was when the temperature changed. She felt it before she saw it. The way sound shifted across the ballroom, conversations dropping half a register, laughter becoming more measured, posture straightening in a slow, involuntary wave that moved through the crowd like wind through grass. She had felt this particular atmospheric shift twice before this season and already knew what it meant. She made herself look slowly, calmly. The Duke of Harcliffe had arrived. He stood at the top of the entrance steps for exactly the amount of time it took to be properly noted, not so long as to seem vain, just long enough to make the room aware, and then descended with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once needed to prove anything. Dark coat, perfectly cut, no unnecessary ornamentation. His jaw was set in the line of someone who had decided years ago not to smile in public unless required. His eyes moved in that same quiet sweep she had observed before, taking everything in, finding nothing interesting. He looks exhausted, she thought, not physically, something deeper. The exhaustion of a man who has played the same role for so long he can no longer remember choosing it. She found that unexpectedly sad. She looked away. Lady Celeste materialized at his side within moments. She had clearly positioned herself for exactly this arrival, and the room rearranged itself around them the way it always did. Eleanor watched for a moment longer, noted the precise flatness of his expression when Lady Celeste touched his arm, and turned back to the grey-haired man by the window, who had finally made his move toward the door. She was composing a quiet, private thought about the sociology of ballroom exits when she felt it. A gaze. Not the accidental kind, not the unfocused sweep of someone's eyes passing over wallpaper and everything in front of it. This was specific, weighted, the kind of attention a person feels on their skin before they can explain how. Eleanor stilled. She did not turn immediately. She had learned, and through years of disappointing herself with hope, not to react to things before she was certain of them. She took one slow breath, adjusted her grip on her fan, and then, with great deliberateness, turned her eyes toward the source. He was looking at her. The Duke of Harcliffe, from across the entire glittering length of the ballroom, was looking directly at her, not past her, not near her, at her. Eleanor held the look for 3 seconds. She counted without meaning to, and then did the only rational thing available. She looked away. Her lungs, however, forgot what they were doing for a moment. She became acutely aware of the painted silk of her fan against her palm, the warmth of 100 candles, the specific sound of her own heartbeat underneath the violins, none of which had been noticeable a moment ago. She pressed her back more firmly against the wall and fixed her gaze somewhere above the refreshment table, and told herself with great conviction that she had imagined it. Men like the Duke of Harcliffe did not look at women like Eleanor Voss. It was simply not the order of things. She almost believed it. Then she heard footsteps, measured, unhurried, moving in her direction across the marble floor, and Lady Celeste's voice, perfectly pitched and perfectly timed, cut across the room like a blade wrapped in silk. "Your Grace, the warmth in it both genuine and possessive. The Countess is asking for you." The footsteps paused, then redirected. Eleanor exhaled, a slow, careful release of something she hadn't entirely acknowledged holding. She did not look to confirm what had happened. She simply stood there in her blue-grey muslin, with her small borrowed pearl earrings and her careful invisibility, and felt her heart beating in a way she would spend the next 3 days failing to explain away. The book appeared on a Tuesday. Eleanor found it on the small writing table in the morning room where she took her tea, a slim volume, no note, no card, no marking of any kind on the outside. She picked it up with the careful attention she gave to anything unexplained. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. A good edition, not new, the spine worn in a way that suggested it had been read by someone who meant it. She turned it over in her hands slowly, then set it down, then picked it up again. She had mentioned this book exactly once. 3 weeks prior, at a dinner at the Ashworths, in a 6-minute conversation with their eldest daughter in a corner, Eleanor had specifically chosen for its distance from the main group. She had said, almost to herself, that she had been looking for a decent copy. There was no rational explanation that didn't either thrill or unsettle her. She told herself it was from her aunt. She asked her aunt. Her aunt looked at her with genuine blankness and said she wouldn't know Marcus Aurelius from a hedgerow. Eleanor sat with the book in her lap for a long time that afternoon. She turned pages without reading them, her mind moving back to that dinner, to the precise layout of the Ashworths' drawing room, to exactly who had been near enough to overhear a quiet conversation in a far corner. There had been one other person. She closed the book, set it face down, stood, walked to the window, stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw set, looking at the street below without seeing it. She reached page 47 on the second evening, running her finger down the margins out of habit, and found it, a line underlined in pencil, faint, precise, intentional. The woman who does not need to be admired is the only one truly worthy of admiration. She read it 3 times, then she placed the book on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling while that sentence moved through her mind like a current she could neither redirect nor stop. The social obligations of the following week brought her into Lady Celeste's orbit 3 times. The first 2 encounters were brief, polite, entirely without consequence. The third was not. It happened at the Wentworths' afternoon gathering, in the small gallery where someone had arranged a display of continental watercolors that nobody was genuinely interested in. Eleanor had retreated there from the drawing room precisely because it was empty. Lady Celeste found her as though she had been looking. She was beautiful in the architectural way of certain women, everything constructed, nothing accidental, every element chosen and placed. Her smile when she saw Eleanor was immediate and warm and carried. Eleanor recognized with some detached admiration an entire message delivered beneath its surface. "Miss Voss," she said, with the particular graciousness that is indistinguishable from condescension until one has learned the difference. "How lovely. You always find the quietest corners, don't you?" "They tend to be the most interesting," Eleanor replied. Lady Celeste laughed, light, measured, and moved to stand beside Eleanor in front of a watercolor of the Rhine. She appeared to consider the painting. "I've been meaning to say," she said conversationally, "how sweet it is when gentlemen take an interest in unexpected places. It must be gratifying." Eleanor kept her eyes on the painting, the Rhine rendered in soft greens and a flat grey sky. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," she said. "Of course you do, darling." The warmth in Lady Celeste's voice didn't shift by a single degree. "I simply want to be sure you're not getting confused. Men like Harcliffe occasionally notice novelty. A small, sympathetic tilt of the head. It never means what it seems to mean." She moved away before Eleanor could respond, trailing perfume and perfect posture behind her. Eleanor stood alone in front of the watercolor of the Rhine for another 4 minutes. Then she went home, took the book from the nightstand and put it at the back of her wardrobe behind a stack of winter shawls. She left it there for 2 days before she took it back out. The Pembrokes garden party was the kind of event Eleanor could tolerate, outdoors spread across enough space that the social pressure diluted in the open air. She had found a bench near the far end of the rose garden, half concealed by a hedgerow, with a clear view of the lawn and no immediate neighbours. She had been there for 20 minutes, nearly content when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She knew before she looked. The quality of them, unhurried, intentional, with a particular weight that her body had apparently decided to recognize without asking permission, moved through her like a tuning fork, finding its note. The Duke of Harcliffe came around the hedge and stopped when he saw her. He didn't perform surprise. He simply looked at her for a moment, then said, "Miss Voss." "Your Grace," she replied. Her voice came out steadier than her pulse, which she was grateful for. He glanced at the bench with the slight inquiry of a man technically asking permission while being fairly confident of the answer. Eleanor moved her shawl. There was barely a conscious decision involved, and he sat. Not close. Appropriate distance. But in the specific quiet of the garden, the distance felt smaller than it was. "You left the Wentworths early last week," he said. "I had a headache." "Did you?" Not a question. Simply a man listening carefully and not entirely convinced. Something about that precision, the way he heard what she didn't say, sent a faint heat climbing the back of her neck that she hoped the autumn air disguised. "How did you know I left early?" she asked. "I noticed." "You notice a great many things about me," she said, keeping her voice measured. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." She looked at him. He was watching the garden, the roses beginning their late-season fade, the light coming through the chestnuts at the angle that meant late afternoon. His profile was as severe as she'd catalogued from across a dozen rooms. but something in the set of his shoulders today was different, slightly less like architecture. "Why?" she asked, and then immediately wished she could take it back, because it was too direct and too much, and this was precisely the kind of conversation she had no map for. He turned his head and looked at her. "Because I find," he said, choosing each word with the care of a man who did not speak carelessly, "that I am aware of when you're in a room, and aware of when you've left it." The rose garden held its breath. Eleanor looked down at her hands in her lap. A small grass stain marked her left glove from when she'd sat down. She studied it with unnecessary intensity, while her mind processed what he had just said, and found no safe place to put it. "That is a very particular thing to say," she managed. "Yes." A pause. "I'm aware of that too." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not the ballroom face, not the public architecture she'd observed from across countless rooms. Something quieter, something that looked with alarming sincerity like genuine attention. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've already said several alarming things." A question seems manageable. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The shadow of one, brief and unguarded, and gone before she could be certain she'd seen it. "What were you reading?" he said. "At Lady Ashworth's dinner. You were near the window before supper. You had a book." Eleanor stared at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things about you," he said, as if it were the most ordinary statement in the world, as if it weren't quietly dismantling something she had spent years constructing inside her chest. "It was poetry," she said after a moment. "Keats." "Which poem?" "Ode to a Nightingale." He was quiet. Then, without preamble, low and without performance, "Where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs." She turned to look at him fully. "You know Keats," she said. "I know loneliness dressed as beauty," he said. "It isn't difficult to recognize." The afternoon light moved through the fading roses. Somewhere on the lawn, laughter rose and fell, bright and distant, belonging entirely to a different world. Eleanor sat with that sentence and felt it settle somewhere it had no business settling. She became aware, with the specific clarity of something becoming impossible to ignore, that her hands were no longer entirely still in her lap. She was saved, or perhaps deprived, she genuinely couldn't determine which, by her aunt's voice carrying through the hedgerow, calling her name with the particular pitch that meant "come be socially present immediately." She stood. He stood with her. Immediate, the reflex of a man raised to certain courtesies. They were briefly very close. She could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension he carried in his jaw even when the rest of him was still, the way he breathed in that moment just slightly differently than before. "Forgive me," she said. "I have to go." "I know." She had taken 3 steps down the path when his voice reached her, even measured, carrying the quality of a statement rather than an invitation. "I'll be at the Ashworth's garden on Thursday, at 3 o'clock. Eleanor did not turn around, but she did not say she wouldn't be there. She went on Thursday. She told herself she was going for the walk. He was already there when she arrived, standing near the stone fountain with his hands behind his back, looking at the water with the expression of someone who had been thinking for a long time about something without an easy answer. He looked up when he heard her. Something in his face, subtle, barely perceptible, shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize and had stopped pretending not to. They walked. No formal decision. They simply began moving in the same direction, and the conversation found them, the way it always did now, as though it had been waiting. He asked her what she actually thought about, not her interests in the approved social catalogue sense, not her accomplishments or her opinions on the season, what occupied her mind when no one was watching. Eleanor, who had never in her life been asked that question by someone who appeared to want the real answer, took a moment to find her footing. "Everything," she said finally. "People, mostly. Why they do what they're expected to do instead of what they want to do. The distance between those two things, and how people learn to live in it." "And what do you want to do?" he asked, "instead of what you do?" She looked at him sideways. "That's a very large question for a garden path." "Garden path," he said, "are where the large questions are most manageable." She thought about it honestly. "I would like to travel," she said. "Not to be presented somewhere, just to go. To be somewhere that doesn't know my name or my family or what I'm supposed to want from life. A pause. I would like, just once, to walk into a room and not already know exactly how it ends. He was quiet for a moment. Do you always know how rooms end? Don't you? Silence, which was, she had learned, one of his ways of saying yes. The letter arrived 4 days later. No name on the outside. Her name on the inside, in a hand she didn't recognize. Spare, unhurried, each word placed with the economy of someone not accustomed to wasting them. He wrote about a sunset from his study window. He didn't describe it beautifully. He described it accurately. The specific quality of the light, the way the color shifted in the final minutes, the fact that he had been looking at papers and had glanced up for no reason at precisely the right moment. He wrote that he had been aware, in that moment, of wanting to tell someone. And I found, the letter said near its end, that the person I wanted to tell was you. I cannot explain it with any precision. I am not certain precision applies here. Eleanor sat down on the hallway bench, a piece of furniture that had never in its existence been sat upon, and read the letter twice more. Then she went to the writing table. She wrote without a name. She wrote about the nightingale she had heard outside her window 3 nights ago, and how it had seemed wrong to be asleep while something was making that sound. She wrote that she didn't tell people things very often, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned that saying things cost something. A piece of yourself extended with no guarantee of what came back. I am finding, she wrote unexpectedly, that some conversations have begun to feel less expensive than I learned to expect. She did not sign it. She sent it. The exchange became a rhythm, unhurried, intimate, belonging entirely to the space between their public selves. He wrote about his estate in Northumberland, about learning Latin under a tutor who believed in silence. She wrote about her father's library before it had to be sold, the specific grief of watching books become transactions. He wrote once, a single line. I have been honest with very few people in my life. I am not certain when that changed. She read that line at midnight by the window and felt the full weight of what was happening settle over her, with the quiet certainty of weather moving in. She was in trouble, the kind that doesn't reveal itself as danger until you are already inside it. The autumn opera season opened on a Thursday, and all of London attended. Eleanor sat in the Voss family's modest box, second tier, partially obstructed by a pillar, in a deep green gown that was her simplest evening dress. Around her the boxes bloomed with feathers and jewels and the deliberate theatre of being seen. Across the auditorium, diamonds caught the chandelier light and threw it back in small constellations. Eleanor's pearl earrings caught nothing. She had chosen them for exactly that reason. She found his box without looking for it. Third tier, directly opposite. He was already there. He was with Lady Celeste. Lady Celeste wore champagne silk and sapphires, and sat beside him with the composed ease of someone who considered that position already hers. She was radiant. She was appropriate. She was everything the world had ordered for a man like the Duke of Harcliffe. Eleanor looked at this for exactly as long as it took to process, then returned her attention to the stage, where the overture was beginning. She told herself the particular hollowness that settled in her chest was simply the appropriate realignment of expectations. She told herself this clearly, and more than once. The music was beautiful. She focused on the music. During the first intermission, she excused herself on the pretext of needing air and walked the long corridor outside the boxes alone. The carpet muffled her footsteps. The corridor was cool and dim after the heat of the auditorium. She had paused at the tall window at the corridor's end, looking down at the lamplit street below, when she heard someone stop behind her. She didn't need to turn. "You came," he said. "I always intended to." She kept her eyes on the street. "I didn't know you would be here." "I always intended to as well." She turned then. He was standing a few feet away in the dim corridor, without Lady Celeste, without the performative posture of public spaces, without anything really, except himself, looking at her with that complete, unhurried attention that she had long since stopped pretending not to feel. "How long before someone notices?" she said. "Not long." "Then don't waste it." Something moved across his face. "I received your last letter," he said, "about your father's library." "You wrote back." "I wrote back badly." A pause, and in that pause she heard something she hadn't heard from him before, the particular quality of a man choosing honesty over performance. I wanted to say that I understood, not the fact of it, the weight of it. Watching something that mattered become something practical. Eleanor felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She turned her face slightly toward the window. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Eleanor." Her name in his voice was a different object entirely from her name in any other context. She felt it move through her like a key turning in something she had believed locked permanently. "Don't," she said, not unkindly, with the desperate pragmatism of someone holding a wall against something larger than the wall. "Why?" "Because there is a woman in your box," she said steadily, "who has been waiting 3 seasons, and there is the world outside this corridor, and I am—" "What?" His voice was very quiet. "Tell me what you are." She looked at him, at the real, unguarded face of a man she had spent 6 weeks discovering through unsigned letters and garden paths and stolen minutes in dim corridors. "I am not someone the world will understand as your choice," she said, gently, accurately, without self-pity, simply the true statement it was. He held her gaze. "The world," he said finally, "has not to date shown notable wisdom about things that matter." From around the curve of the corridor, Lady Celeste's voice reached them, bright, carrying, precisely timed. Eleanor stepped back. "Go," she said. "Please." He went. She stood at the window until the bell rang for the second act. She went back to her box and sat through the rest of the opera, with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in polite attention while, beneath it, something moved in slow, irrevocable increments toward a conclusion she wasn't ready for. 3 days later, an anonymous letter arrived, not for Eleanor but for her aunt. It was brief, specific, and surgical. It suggested that Miss Voss had been observed in a private corridor with a gentleman widely known to be spoken for, and that her conduct throughout the season raised questions a respectable household could not afford to ignore. Her aunt came to her with the letter in shaking hands and an expression that was more frightened than angry, which was worse. Eleanor read it once, and read. "It's from Lady Celeste," she said, "and most of it is technically untrue." "Most of it," her aunt repeated. The word hung in the room between them. Eleanor set the letter on the table and looked at her aunt, at the 4 years of effort written in the lines around her eyes, at the real fear of what a letter like this could cost a woman in their position. "We were in a corridor," she said carefully. "We spoke for less than 3 minutes. There was nothing improper." She paused. "But I understand how it looks, and I understand what it means." Her aunt sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The letter sat on the table between them like a verdict, and Eleanor, for the first time, allowed herself to feel the real weight of what she had been walking toward, not with longing, but with clear eyes, because the world didn't need proof. It only needed a story, and Lady Celeste had just written one. She wrote the last letter on a Sunday morning. She sat at the writing table for a full hour before she began, and then she wrote without stopping, because stopping meant reconsidering, and reconsidering was something she could no longer afford. "I think we should not continue this," she wrote, "not because what has happened between us was not real. I believe it was, and I will not insult either of us by pretending otherwise, but real things in impossible circumstances do not become possible simply by being real. There is a woman who has been patient. There is my aunt who has given 4 years of her life to my future. There is a letter now in circulation that will not disappear simply because its contents are false. I am not asking you to defend me. I am asking you to let this be what it should have remained, something that existed in gardens and unsigned letters and 3 minutes in a corridor and nowhere else. I will not sign this one. I think we both know it isn't necessary." She sealed it before she could read it back. She sent it before she could unseal it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever lived inside. She had believed it would feel like relief. The practical, self-protective part of her had promised this, that once the decision was made, the tightness in her chest would resolve into something livable, that the correct choice would feel, if not good, then at least stable. It did not feel stable. It felt like a room with all the air removed. The anonymous letter had already moved. She heard it second-hand. A comment here, an averted gaze there, the particular way certain women's smiles thinned when she entered a room. Nothing overt. Nothing she could confront directly. simply the slow machinery of social consequence beginning to turn. Her aunt said nothing, but Eleanor watched her count invitations that didn't arrive. She told her aunt on Wednesday that she planned to visit her cousin Margaret in Bath. Her aunt looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who understood more than she was being told, and said only that she would help with the packing. On Thursday, Eleanor's trunks were half filled. On Friday, no letter arrived. On Saturday, no letter arrived. She told herself this confirmed everything. He had accepted. He was wise enough to understand. It was done. On Sunday morning, she was folding her green opera gown, the one she had been about to leave behind before her hands had stopped, inexplicably, on the fabric, when the housemaid knocked. "Miss Voss, there is a caller in the drawing room. Tell my aunt—" "He asked specifically for you, miss." The girl's expression carried the careful neutrality of someone relaying information they didn't entirely understand. "He didn't leave a card." Eleanor set the gown down. "Did he give a name?" "No, miss, but—" The girl paused. "He arrived on horseback, alone, no footman." Eleanor stood very still in the middle of her half-packed room. Dukes did not arrive on horseback, alone, without footman. They did not do this. It was not done. She pressed both palms flat against the surface of the trunk and took one slow breath. Then she walked out the door and down the stairs toward whatever was waiting below. He was standing by the window. Not sitting, standing with his back partially to the door, looking out at the narrow slice of London street visible between the curtains. He turned when he heard her. He was not wearing his public face. He was not wearing any face she had catalogued from across rooms and corridors and seasons. He looked, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, like a man without architecture. She closed the door and stood near it. The full width of the drawing room between them felt both insufficient and necessary. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Fact, not accusation. "No," he agreed. "If anyone sees—" "I know." "The letter is already moving," she said. "Lady Celeste has made sure of that. Every hour you're here makes it worse for me. You understand that?" Something moved across his face, as swift and unmistakable. Not guilt, something sharper. The expression of a man who has just heard a consequence stated clearly for the first time and does not like what it costs someone else. "I know," he said. And then, with the measured precision of a man choosing to be specific, "That is why I intend to call on your aunt this week, formally, to make clear, in a way that cannot be misread or manipulated, exactly what my intentions are." A pause. "Lady Celeste's letter will not survive the announcement of a formal courtship." Eleanor stared at him. "You came here to tell me that." "I came here because I have been trying for 8 days to be sensible about this," he said, "and I find I am not able to do it from a distance." The drawing room was very quiet. From upstairs, her aunt moved about in an entirely different world. Eleanor crossed her arms. Not in coldness, in the specific posture of someone trying to hold themselves together while something methodically disassembles their careful arrangements. "You don't need to protect me," she said. "That is not why I wrote to you. I know it isn't." Then, "I am not here to protect you," he said. "I am here because I made a decision, and then I let you make a decision for me. And that was a failure of honesty on my part." She looked at him across the room, at this man who had ridden across the city alone, without his armor, without his footman, and was now standing in her aunt's drawing room saying the most direct thing she had ever heard him say. "I have lived," he continued, "for many years in a very particular way, correctly, within the exact dimensions of what was expected." His voice was level, but beneath it she could hear something moving, something with the quality of water finding a path through stone. "I was skilled at it. I told myself I preferred it." "And?" "And then you were standing against the wall at Thornfield House," he said, "not performing, not wanting anything from anyone in that room. And you were the most real thing I had seen in years." He took one step forward, then stopped. "Not because you were a novelty, not because I was bored or confused or in want of an interesting diversion." His eyes held hers without wavering. "Because I recognized it, the way you had learned to take up less space, the decision to be invisible as a form of protection." Eleanor's chest was very tight. "Because I had been doing the same thing," he said, "for considerably longer, and I was profoundly tired of it." The morning light came through the curtains at the angle of late autumn, pale and particular, falling across the worn carpet and the half-closed door and the distance between them. "James," she said, and stopped herself, because she had never said his name aloud before, only written it once in a letter she had immediately burned, and now it sat in the air of the drawing room between them with an intimacy she hadn't planned. He stilled. She pressed on. "What you're describing," she said carefully, "is recognition, resonance. Those are real things. I'm not dismissing them." She exhaled. "But they are not enough to hold against the weight of what your life actually requires. Your family, your name, the entire structure of what people expect." "Yeah," he said. So I am asking," he said with the focused patience of a man who has thought this through completely, "if you will allow me to demonstrate over time, through the correct channels, in the full view of the world that concerns you, that I mean this." A pause. Not as a feeling, as a choice. The room was very still. From somewhere upstairs, Eleanor heard the sound of her aunt's footsteps moving toward the stairs. She looked at the man in front of her, at the real, unguarded, slightly terrifying fact of him. This person who had ridden here alone, who had written her letters without his name on them, who had stood in a garden and quoted Keats without performance, and who was now standing in her aunt's drawing room dismantling his own armour piece by piece, and handing her the inventory. "You may call," she said quietly, formally, with my aunt present. Something crossed his face, something she had never seen there before in any ballroom or garden or corridor, something open, something that looked unmistakably like relief. "At 3 o'clock, he said. Her aunt's footsteps reached the landing. "At 3 o'clock, Eleanor confirmed. Spring came slowly to London that year, tentatively at first, as though uncertain of its welcome, then all at once, the way it always did. The announcement appeared in the papers on the 15th of March. The reaction was precisely what Eleanor had anticipated and somewhat less painful than she had feared. Bewilderment was the prevailing register, polite in some quarters, less polite in others. She heard it second-hand through letters and her aunt's careful reports of conversations at the market. She found with some surprise that it bothered her considerably less than she had spent months expecting. Lady Celeste's letter had not survived the formal courtship, exactly as he had said. The machinery that had begun to turn against Eleanor reversed itself with the smooth indifference of a world that follows power rather than principle. She noted this with the same detached clarity with which she noted everything. His mother required 3 conversations before arriving at something resembling acceptance. Eleanor attended all 3 without flinching. The Duchess appeared to find this grudgingly impressive. The estate in Northumberland was larger than Eleanor had imagined from the letters. The library alone required 2 full afternoons to properly explore. She gave it 3. On an evening in late May, 4 months after the announcement, 6 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor was sitting in the Harcliffe Library with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, watching the last light change in the windows. The fire had settled into quiet coals. Outside, the wind moved through the Northumberland hills with a sound like breathing. She heard his footsteps on the stone floor before she saw him. She knew them now with the certainty of something learned by the body rather than the mind. Her pulse, she noticed with fond resignation, had still not learned to be indifferent to them. He came in without announcement. He rarely announced himself in his own house to his wife, and stopped when he saw her. The look that passed between them crossed the room like a conversation, requiring no translation. He came and sat in the chair beside her. For a moment they were simply in the same room, in the quiet.